Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The usual challenge of not having unmuted my mic before I started to speak. Uh, welcome, welcome to Deloitte Technology, Media, and Telecom Predictions. I'm Sudarshan. I'm the Deloitte India TMT leader, and it's my pleasure to welcome this audience in what I hope would be an engaging session over the next hour or so. Just to set a backdrop of what these predictions are, I think some of you would have attended our earlier versions. And with this frequent waves of the pandemic, digitization of the economy, the gig interplay in the workforce become increasingly difficult to make predictions. But nevertheless, we've gone out on a limb to make some brave forecasts. These range from the, as I call them, the exigent to the esoteric, for what's happening around the burning issues of chip shortage to floating solar panels. But we aren't missing out on the key issues of social consciousness. Things like gender parity in the TMT sector, apps on mental health, mental well-being. So I would believe that we're going to have an engaging session ahead of us. With me are my colleagues and architects of this global research. Duncan, who is the director of our TMT Research Center in Canada, and Paul, who leads global industries research, specializing in TMT. So these are the architects of the entire global predictions, and me and my colleagues from India will supplement some of it from an India perspective. Just a word of caution, people out here. This is a TMT event. We thought of using a new technology. So we have introduced a new technology, which we believe is more engaging, and we crave your indulgence if there are any small glitches. There is a Q&A on the sidebar, which you can minimize if you want the larger screen. There's a Q&A, and any questions can be entered there, and me and my colleagues will be happy to address that. So over to you, Paul, to kickstart this session.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be with you all on this virtual stage and trying out this new technology. And it's always great to see how this technology iterates year after year. Several of us are going to be talking through the predictions for this year. We have 19 in total for this year, but we have selected the ones which we believe are of most interest for the audience that we have with you. So if I can have the next slide, please. I'm just waiting for the slides to warm up. So as we do that, one thing I'll just mention is that we had over 100 people who contributed to the predictions around the world, including from your continent this year. So the most people ever. So you can see over here that we have 19 topics. They're arranged by themes as opposed to by tech, media and telecoms, because the overspill between each of tech, media and telecoms is becoming so great now. It makes most sense to talk about these themes. And we've got something from all of these themes to talk to you about today. So screens, semis, connectivity, healthcare, new and next, and green and diverse. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking to you about 5 of the predictions. And then after that, Duncan will talk over the remaining 5 of them. And we'll have some India-specific commentary from our colleagues as well, to add some of the local flavour to these predictions, because they're always global and also local as well. So if I can have the next slide, please. So the first topic I want to talk about is video on demand. And in 2022, what we're seeing is a shift in the nature of the subscription video on demand market globally. So the shift that we're seeing is that we're moving from a period of growth with lots of subscribers to be added to the pot, to a period of consolidation, saturation in terms of the total number of subscribers. And also what we're seeing is that we're reaching a phase where churn is becoming quite element. So when we look at the US market, a couple of years ago, churn rates were already hitting 30%. And we see this feature of the market starting to hit through from now. So as you can see on the right hand side there, what we're showing there is some data that we generated from our digital consumer trends survey, which shows in light green the penetration rate of subscription video on demand in a range of countries. And there are quite a few there which are at 75% or so penetration. And then also the churn rates. And the churn rates go up to about 25% in some markets and a lot lower in others. But we expect that number to go up quite a bit over the course of this year as an inevitable result of the fact that we're reaching the ceiling in the total number of available subscribers. So the churn number that we're expecting for this year is about 150 million subscriptions which will get cancelled, which sounds quite onerous, particularly when you consider the cost of having to reclaim those subscribers to add to them. And in some markets, the cost of acquiring a subscriber is about $100. That sounds a bit alarming, but one of the things to bear in mind is, as well as churn, there is unchurn, which is a bit of an ugly word, which is people who dip in and out of their subscriptions. So that's one thing to consider. The next slide, please. So when we talk about what does this mean for the industry, one of the biggest implications that we see out there is a need to vary the subscription approach by country. So in the early days of SVOD, when a lot of SVOD was targeted at developed countries with similar levels of GDP per capita, you could more or less take the model that you developed in, let's say, North America and reprint it in different markets, and that would work. As you move to more and more markets and you add in more subscribers, you have to become a lot more flexible as to how you develop your subscriptions. So we look at Latin America, we look at Asia. There is a need to introduce or offer advertising within that model as well as subscription. So something for everyone, and that's something which we expect to happen over the course of this year and the years to come. If we look at the next slide, we talk about what companies should do. And what we believe is important is about pricing tiers and having the appropriate prices per market. The second recommendation is to partner with groups of with companies which already have large direct-to-consumer relationships. So these may be telcos, but there may even be price comparison sites. But you want to work with those players. And of course, the third point is around using data to help with the customization of those segments, of those tiers. Now, I'd just like to hand over to a colleague to talk a bit about the Indian context.
Thank you. I just thought I'd add, a couple of minutes worth of the India perspective. And a lot of what you said, Paul, is starting to happen in India, such as multi-tiered pricing structures, AWOD existing with SWOD. But India, I think, is still in the early stage of what we call the streaming wars. We have over 40 OTT apps, and with more on the way, various cuts, general, regional, genre specific, uh, growing by the day. And the investments in customer acquisition are going to be expensive, with increasing amounts of money going into content, tentpole content, as well as customer acquisition. We spent about $700 million on content last year, edging to $1 billion in the next couple of years on an annual basis. Regional continues to be very powerful. Hindi was obviously the largest sector, genre or language in India, but regional seems to be edging up. We crossed 50% in terms of regional content, and AWOD, I think, continues its dominance, at least in terms of revenue. India's up at approximately 102 million subscribers on SWOD, but AWOD will continue, and a very healthy AWOD system will continue. Uh, Unlike a lot of consumers in the West, we don't see Indian consumers cutting the cord in favor of OTT. I think linear and OTT will continue to coexist because linear continues to be, pay TV continues to be extremely cheap in India, and individual viewing happens on OTT while group viewing or family viewing happens on linear because we're still a 95% or so single television household country. So just some nuances of the Indian market right there.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, if we go to the next slide, we'll go to the next topic, which is also looking at media, and we're looking at games consoles, which are 50 years old this year. And normally what we find is it's a very tough market to be in, the device market, and there's always companies which are looking to challenge and device form factors which are looking to try and assert. But what we see, what we're predicting, is that the games console is reaching its 50th birthday, or its half century, in the best health ever. So we're expecting a 10% increase in revenues for the industry. So that follows 2 pandemic years. So that's a pretty strong rate of growth. And we also believe that the revenue per user will be the highest of all the device categories. So compared to console or compared to smartphone devices, as you can see, consoles, as you can see on the right-hand side, have the highest revenue per user. So one reason why consoles have done very well is because they've gone through a digital transformation over the last 10 years. So they've shifted to online distribution of content. They've also moved to the delivery of a lot of multiplayer elements to their game. And they've also enabled a migration to regular playing as opposed to occasional playing. So all of those elements have helped grow revenues and make the appeal of the console quite enduring. So if we look at the next slide, one of the points I want to cover off is around console versus cloud gaming. So cloud gaming is whereby the game is played on servers in the cloud, and the resulting video images are sent through to the user. To be able to do that in 4K with HDR, you need about 45 megabits per second to 50 megabits per second, because the image moves a lot and is very rich. So the current compromise of having a powerful edge device, which is a console, and sending data about what's shifted or what's changed over a relatively small connection is a more powerful benefit. One other element we'd mention is, when we think of media subscriptions, we often think about SVOD, we think about AVOD, we think about music, but don't overlook games. So there are over 200 million subscriptions to games companies at the moment, mostly for multiplayer, but increasingly for content. The next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations, for console makers, what we recommend is a migration to more cloud-based elements, and we expect that to be happening over the course of the decade, and that's already happening right now. For cloud gaming to take off, so for those players in that market, the challenges around having original content and enough of a base of users to encourage or entice people from their existing ecosystems. And thirdly, around games publishers, which have been in the news a lot over the course of this year, there's a massive value in legacy content to be tapped into. And I expect for the next 20 years, we'll still be playing the same kind of game, but in ever higher resolution. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about the next topic, which is around NFTs, and specifically sports NFTs. And about a year ago, the headlines were starting to pop with news about NFTs in the sports market. So this was mostly for basketball in the US. And the headlines were all about the massive amounts which are being paid for NFTs. And I'd say for NFTs, there are 2 major applications. One of them is speculation, and one of them is simply around collection. And it's a collection part, which is what we're focusing on over here. And the collection part is around the digitization of a part of a fan experience of being a sports fan. So you will have heard of trading cards, which are bits of paper, but some of those bits of paper are worth millions of dollars because of their provenance, because of who might have signed them, because of their rarity. And when you do a digital transformation on trading cards, effectively you get NFTs. And the reason why you need NFTs is because what they enable is the application of scarcity to digital content. And if you think about the relationship of technology with media over the last few centuries, it's all been about making it easier and easier to create better and better copies of media content. The printing press, the cinema, the photocopier, the smartphone camera, all of them do a similar thing. NFTs reverse that by placing a piece of content within a contract, and which is then placed on the blockchain. And so when you think about sports NFTs, what I encourage you to think about is this is a digital upgrade to collecting. The speculation element gets more headlines, drives bigger numbers, but that's a very, very narrow group of people who do that kind of activity. Kind of the next slide, please. So in terms of what to think about this, so for most sports teams, I'd expect them to develop an NFT capability at some time. And this is something that's been happening, for many years. So you think about, clips which are shared on social media. This is a new medium based on existing content that's emerged over the last 20 years. And then there was a whole set of revenue also, which is, say, from video games, which you just talked about, which again is additional revenues. So we're still at the phase of experimentation. We're still at the phase where we need to make it as easy as possible for consumers to access this kind of content. But the bottom line is additional revenues in the short term and in the long term because of long-term commissions built into the smart contract in NFTs. The next slide. So what is it companies should do? If you're a sports entity, definitely look at that. We've had lots and lots of inbound inquiries around how to get into NFTs. Regulators also need to look at this because with any new technology, there's always scope for abuse. And then the last point is something which comes up a lot, is around the carbon footprint of NFTs. Because they're linked to the blockchain, there can be a massive carbon footprint in minting or adding the information to the blockchain. But that's not implicit. There are many blockchains which are emerging, which are designed to provide that blockchain capability, but without the carbon footprint of something like Bitcoin or even Ethereum. And if I could just hand over to my colleague who will talk about some of the implications for India on this for the next minute or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And as you said, globally, NFT marketplace is growing at a very scorching pace, and some reports peg the market at more than 20 billion worth NFTs has been traded the last financial year. Now, India, as you've noticed, is seeing initial action here, mostly led by sports, specifically cricket, and movies, specifically the Bollywood market. And we believe that the entertainment and sports NFTs will disrupt the industry in India. Specifically, this has a potential to bring in non-millennials who into the mainstream of digital, and there is also an opportunity for media, museums, collectors, arts, all of these people to get into this NFT phenomenon. We believe India will be a volume-based market, and that too will help because of Indians' penchant, and we would see a lot of fractional NFTs driving this volume-based market. There is also an opportunity for digital artifacts and the physical artifacts to be monetized by the government on many of the artifacts that the government is owning. Now, from a future perspective, clarity on regulatory and other policy aspects is awaited, and that's very important for the market to realize its potential. And subject to this, there is a high possibility that this could be a $1 billion market potential in the near to midterm for the India NFT market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We're now going to shift gears a little bit and move to another major theme for the industry. So go to the next slide, please. And this is looking at renewable energy, specifically solar. And the facet that we're looking at for solar is around floating solar, which is something which you may not have heard of, but which is important to bear in mind, because we will need to move to more and more renewable energy. And when we look at all the different sources of renewable, then solar is one of the most important of those elements. So there's a lot more capacity which has gone in over the last few years, and there's a lot more capacity that will be added. Now, in many markets, solar has been something which has been placed in areas where there is lots of land. But one of the approaches which has grown, particularly in Asia, is placing solar panels on water. So that's why it's called floating solar. And as the title writes out or depicts, this is about adding to renewable energy options. And every addition at the moment, I think, is going to be very important. And the reason why Asia Pacific is particularly strong at floating solar is because of the availability of places which are tranquil to put solar panels. So if I compare where you are to bits of Europe, we've been having, I think we've had 3 storms in the last week, and they're storms of significance such that they're given a name. So when the storm is given a name, you need to worry, but we've had 3 in the last week. So anything in the North Sea is not going to last for very long. But if you've got more tranquil places, then that can work very well. And also in, say, the Asian region, there are some areas where land is scarce and is needed for, and is already mostly taken up. But there are areas of sea which are calm where you can add in floating solar. And of course, there's reservoirs where you can put in solar panels. And you can also even have a combination of solar panels which sit on top of dams used for hydroelectric and which are used in combination. So floating solar we see is very, very interesting, as growing in capacity, as you can see on the right hand side there. And it's not something which is going to be, I think, as marked in terms of growth in Europe, where you've got sufficient land, and also got hydro and wind, or also in the US where you've got a lot of land to put solar. So this is something where Asia Pacific is like to have the lead. So if we look at the next slide, we can talk a bit more about where they can be deployed. And so lakes, reservoirs are some areas, and even places like fish farms have been shown to be working quite well. And one of the big questions often asked about floating solar is, if you put floating solar onto a lake, what does that do to the marine wildlife? And actually it can help. One of the challenges that we face at the moment is around evaporation from water masses, particularly indoor water masses. And one thing which floating solar does is it can control that evaporation. Also, the water, the coolness of the water, cools the solar panels and can make them more productive as a result. So there is a good degree of mutual benefit in having solar panels on water. There is also additional expense in making them float. And so it's not like a slam dunk solution, but it's one which is viable and worth considering. Now, in terms of what companies should do about this, we've got a whole list of considerations on the next slide to think about. So, and they range from, for example, so one of the implications, say, for tech companies is as a promoter of floating solar as a way to reduce their carbon footprint. So in terms of future contracts for renewables, one of the biggest buyers of energy is, or renewable energy is, tech companies. There's also, if we think about other implications, the Silicon Valley within there, there's a planning of floating solar. There's the batteries used to store excess power. So there are lots of potential beneficiaries of floating solar, both as a buyer and also as a supplier. So I'm just going to hand over to a colleague from our India practice to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Actually, when you mentioned this topic to me first up some time back, right, I was also indeed surprised about this. And what actually surprised me more was we have 200 megawatts plus of installed capacity in floating solar in India as I speak now. So this is a fledgling, but not a completely novel topic. The idea being that you said that two things which are very relevant to us. One is in India, we have constraints in availability of land, significant constraints in availability of land, and a high difficulty of acquisition, resettlement. I mean, the land-related challenges are significant in our country. The second is we have a large number of water bodies, including estuaries along the coastline and internal water bodies, reservoirs, ponds, lakes. So there is a large open area for utilization or for installation of such solar panels. The third, again, you talked about this too, you mentioned this. India still has a significant hydro capacity with large reservoirs. So evacuation of power generated becomes much easier if we have these floating panels on reservoirs. So we do look at this as a opportunity that probably will be mined very, very significantly. Our objective, and India has very, very ambitious targets in terms of solar. I think 280 or 300 GW, something of that number. I forgotten the number, but very large number. But it is believed that we can probably achieve 30% of that number through these panels, and that's a remarkably high number. The costs are a bit high. Floating solar does cost a bit more than install land solar. But I would believe that the benefits outweigh the costs. And you said that again, tech companies, large tech companies, more importantly, data centers in the country, which consume a lot of power. And there are many, many, many such data centers coming up. I think if they have this back-to-back arrangement, could be significant beneficiaries of this new development. So we believe this is something that's here to stay. Paul, over to you. Back to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. So the last topic I'll talk about before handing over to Duncan is about wearable technology in healthcare. So this is part of our look at what's happening with technology and the healthcare market. And the image that we've used for this is a smartwatch. And it's interesting to think that when smartwatches were first popularized, so this is back in 2014, they were positioned prominently as a replacement for analog watches. And then they went through a kind of iteration of becoming a fitness device. And now they're iterating again to become more and more prominent as healthcare devices. And I guess that's how you take this product to becoming truly mass market, is because the volume of people who want to be well is always going to be even greater than those who would like to be just fit and share their fitness activities with other people, so as part of the quantified self. So the overriding prediction that we have, so the quantifiable elements of this, is around the volume of devices. So you can see on the right hand side, so you look for 2021 through to 2024, a steady rise in the volumes of consumer health and wellness wearable devices shipping. So we're expecting 320 million devices this year across all different products, reaching 440 million products by 2024. And we're talking about smartwatches, we're also talking about fitness bands, and we're also talking about what are called smart patches, which are specifically designed to provide diagnosis or even dosage. So there are lots of these elements coming through. Have the next slide, please. So the headline over here is around preventative healthcare, because a lot of healthcare in many markets tends to be reactive. And the more data that we have about people's conditions, particularly for men who tend not to be monitored as much as soon as they sort of reach sort of young adulthood or even become teens, until they need help. So there is a big lack of data on all those individuals. And what smartwatches or fitness bands can do is start collecting a lot of data and provide really early warning signals when things are perhaps going wrong, but can be addressed with little drama. And you may have come across, or you may have some devices which, for example, track heart rate and can identify irregular rhythms in heart rates. And these have already been proven in a few cases to have been really fundamental to saving lives. And the last slide, so if you can just move to the last slide there. So what can companies do? So one of the biggest topics around this is around doctor skepticism. So you've got tech companies which are creating products which are useful for healthcare, but then as with a lot of things, what you need to do is address the reluctance to accept change. So that's one of the things which needs to happen, is addressing medical industry skepticism about the utility of these and integrating the data into healthcare systems. And of course, as part of that, keeping devices secure is going to be very important, because this data could be used malignly. And of course, always to keep innovating. So, and it's difficult to create medical grade sensors which fit into tiny devices like smartwatches or fitness monitors. But compared to 10 years ago for fitness bands, what we have now is way better in way larger volumes. So I'll hand over now to Duncan to talk about the next topic on mental health apps. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Paul. One thing I should mention, I'm a former biotech analyst, and a lot of those smartwatches and smart patches are actually getting approval from regulatory authorities around the world. These are much more than just toys. These are FDA, Health Canada, EU approved for those indications. But we can measure much more than just physical health. Let's talk about mental health. As a result of the pandemic, increasing stress, anxiety, we are seeing levels of depression and anxiety soar around the world. One of the tools for fighting that are mental health apps. Deloitte is predicting that this market, which was only about $200 million a few years ago, will soar to nearly $500 million by the end of this year. That growth rate, we're calling for 20%, we think is frankly conservative. Next slide, please. Now, why does this matter? A few reasons. One of them is that traditional treatment for mental health has tended to focus on either talk therapy or medication, and those on their own or combined can be effective. But studies, once again, clinical studies, clinical trials approved by health regulators, have demonstrated that mental health apps can provide a third leg to that stool, supporting traditional forms of mental health by being a constant reminder, not unlike a healthcare wearable that's with you 24/7. So is a smartphone, able to encourage people to take their medicine, see their doctors, do their exercises, provide a lifeline if somebody perhaps is feeling depressed. But one of the other things, and Sudarshan and I had a great couple of interviews yesterday with some Indian reporters. One of the really interesting angles on this is looking at the bridging the health divide. Not everybody around the world lives somewhere where there is adequate mental health support, and in some countries, there's a stigma around mental health. Now, we'll talk more about that in a second, but can I have my final slide, please? What should companies do? Monetization is part of it. A number of these mental health apps currently are free or charge minimal dollars. They are looking at how to get more money out of this. One of the ways may be through employer-sponsored mental health apps. That's certainly something we see a lot more of. Obviously, where are the challenges? as Paul already mentioned about physical wearables, mental health data is something that people are worried about and concerned about. Privacy, security, transparency are the key words here. I'd now like to pull in one of my Indian colleagues for the local perspective on this.
Thank you, Duncan. Everything you said was bang on for India, and a couple of other points specifically to India is a lot of people don't know that 15% of the global mental health market, about 200 million people, is in India, and the resources required to help these 200 million people are woefully inadequate. Coverage is a huge issue. Awareness is a huge issue. For example, India only has 0.29 psychiatrists and 0.07 psychologists for every 100,000 people, which is even lower than the emerging market average. So mental health apps here I see can really, like you said, bridge the gap, and not only given access, but in a country like India, there is still somewhat of a stigma around mental health. So people are still very reluctant in many cases to go out and seek help, even though they might know that they need help. And an app is a step in that direction, which they can do themselves. And especially Gen Z and millennial India, almost 35-36% of them have a fitness app on their phones today. And having a mental health app is a step in the same direction.
If we can have physical health apps, why can't we have mental health apps, right, Jahil? Love that
Exactly.
context. Thank you.
And Jahil,
Next slide, please.
sorry, Duncan and Jahil. Just one point which I wanted to flavor to what Jahil said. Jahil, you talked about the stigma, and the app is the step to remove it, and it's a great assistance, not just in that fashion. It's also a great assistance because the stigma is not as much about disclosing to the doctor or the psychiatrist. It is stigma about the world around us knowing about it. So if there is a connectivity that can enable a direct interaction with the psychologist or the psychiatrist without the prying eyes in that, if I can say that, yeah, I think it eases a lot more. It provides for a lot more communication.
Right.
That's it. Back to you, Duncan. Sorry.
Thanks. Next slide. So I'm not sure if you've heard, but there's a chip shortage going on. It's pretty bad. It's not going away. So our prediction is that this chip shortage will last through the end of 2022. That's bad. We even say, you can see right here, it may even reach into 2023. That's worse. In new and updated version of this, I am seeing some worrying signs that certain kinds of chips may not only be stretching into 2023, but in fact be sold out for the duration of 23 into 24. That will make this the deepest, longest, most severe chip shortage in history. We are well over $500 billion in impact, growing day by day, could end up being close to $1 trillion. We are hopeful it will be less severe, but I really want to wave my arms at everybody on the call here. Yes, it's the leading edge chips. Yes, it's the 300 millimeter wafers, 3 to 5 nanometer feature size, the stuff found in phones, computers, and data centers. But it is also in those trailing edge methodologies, 200 millimeter wafers, 75 nanometer, 150. These are 20-year-old technologies, but demand from auto, from consumer, from appliances, from factories is so high that we are seeing shortage across the entire semiconductor value chain. Now, people are building more plants, and that's good. Why don't I talk about that right now? There are plants being built around the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars in capex from the big chip companies, hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies and incentives from the US, the EU, China, around the world. India, I think, as you know, I don't want to steal my Indian colleagues' thunder here, but I know it's coming there too. So that's good. Localization is good. Question I always get, I'm going to actually take this away before I even get to the Q&A. Duncan, is it good if the EU builds more local capacity? Yes. Is it good if the US builds more local capacity? Yes. India, yes. Will it solve our interdependence? No. It will help, but at the end of the day, we live in a globally interdependent economy, and we will always be vulnerable to the next shortage, the next supply interruption. Next slide, please. Now, why does all this matter so much? Back when I started in technology in 1990, the average car had $3 to $4 worth of chips, and they were mainly in the clock radio. In 2022, it can be $1,000 worth of chips. And if you haven't got the chips, you haven't got a car. I was talking to a US manufacturer that is looking for parking for 600,000 cars that are perfectly finished, except for the chips. They are critical. That content is rising. Next slide, please. And what should we do? Build plants, but at the same time, develop a digital capabilities model, chip buyers and distributors, digital supply networks, share information earlier, often more transparent. Please, if you're interested with this one, reach out to me after the event. Deloitte has published, and I've co-authored a 25-page report talking about 5 fixes for the semiconductor supply chain. So we have a wealth of detail on that one. Next slide, please. India context. Sudarshan, you're still muted.
I'm on mute. Yeah, I keep going on mute, and I need to remember. Yeah, thanks, Duncan. So yeah, so Duncan, that's news to us that there's a chip shortage. we are now we now have a waiting line of at least 3 months for a car now, 3 months minimum for a car. So we are on the queue too. Yeah, and the worst part about India is our market is set to explode. We are consuming more and more chips per capita than ever before. The expectation is we'll be about 4 times the requirement of chips just 5 years down the line. So I really don't know. This is an issue that I think needed a policy address, and we did get it about 2 months ago. Many people in the audience would know about it. The government had earmarked a new initiative for the fab, for semiconductor fab. Now, that's great news. Now, is that going to immediately alleviate our challenges? No. The easing up for the next current year and the next year will be broadly aligned with what happens globally. But in 3 years' time, I'm hoping that to some measure, our localization initiative would yield some results, would yield some strategic depth, would alleviate our supply chain concerns to some extent. And we also believe that there was a policy to encourage electronic manufacturing sector a few years ago, which seems to have paid off. We also have a pool of talent in design. So if we have to triangulate all these three, to some extent, I think we should be setting an agenda of our own 3 years down the line. But for the current short term, we believe we'll be completely aligned to whatever happens globally. Back to you.
Thanks. One thing I should mention, along with a chip shortage, there's a talent shortage. As you try building plants in the US, in new states, in new places in Europe, in India, in Singapore, in Israel, we need the engineers to work in those plants. And that talent is there's a talent shortage in all parts of the market. It's even worse in chips. Now, here's a kind of connectivity one. I want to talk about Wi-Fi 6. What is Wi-Fi 6? It's the thing that comes after Wi-Fi 5. In the same way that 5G offers higher speeds, better densities, and lower latency than 4G, Wi-Fi 6 does all of that. And in a bit of a surprise to many people around the world, Wi-Fi 6 devices are actually going to outsell 5G by 60%, 2.5 billion Wi-Fi 6 devices compared to only 1.5 billion devices for 5G. Now, what's driving that, at least in part, is the enterprise market. A couple of years ago, Paul and I co-authored a prediction where we were looking for significant enterprise adoption of 5G inside. But we did a survey, Deloitte did a survey, taking a look at 437 global networking executives last year, asking them about their advanced networking preferences. Now, as you can see from this chart, they're all over 5G and they're all over Wi-Fi 6. Next slide, please. But the interesting thing is that as we look here, you can see on that second bullet point, according to our executives, although everybody is looking at both, Wi-Fi 6 pilots and deployments are well ahead of 5G in all 9 geographies we studied. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why. The average enterprise IT department is expert at installing Wi-Fi and doesn't know much about installing 5G. Spectrum in many geographies, enterprises can't directly access spectrum. That complicates things. There's the chip shortage, as I've mentioned. The cost of 5G modules is 10 or 20 times higher than Wi-Fi 6. But at the end of the day, one of the really interesting things is this chart on your right here. There are times and cases and places when 5G is better than Wi-Fi, and there are times and places and cases when it's the other way around. But when you talk to the average enterprise, most of their employees are indoors and on campus most of the time. Most of their machines inside factories are on campus and in fixed use cases. There are times and places where 5G is the better or the only solution, but for the vast majority of advanced wireless needs, Wi-Fi 6 may be either the right solution or good enough. Next slide, please. Now, what should companies do? Be clear about goals, determine your usage scenarios, but critically treat advanced networking as core to your innovation architecture. 3/4 of those we surveyed said that advanced wireless could create significant competitive advantage. I will go further. Companies that get the right mix of Wi-Fi 6 and 5G and migrate seamlessly and make them work well together, those will be the successful enterprises of the future. Those that fail will do less well. Next slide, please. Now, bit of a shift. Normally, when I talk about a prediction, you've heard this from Paul, you've heard it from me, every time we give you hard numbers. You can't really do that about regulation. I can tell you that historically, AI, machine learning, has been lightly regulated or self-regulated, and that is about to shift. Both in the EU, in the US, in China, in Canada, in Australia, in multiple geographies, regulators are looking at cracking down on the use of AI, ranging from relatively light obligations to, here's an example from the EU, high-risk technologies having severe conformity obligations with annual reporting and massive fines should you be caught violating. Next slide, please. What we're looking at here is all about bias. This is a great quote from Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, FTC Commissioner. Mounting evidence reveals that AI can produce biased, discriminatory, and unfair outcomes, that's bad, in a variety of high-stakes economic spheres, including employment, credit, healthcare, and housing. This is a severe issue. Why? AI does not eliminate human bias, okay? AI does not reflect human bias. AI amplifies human bias. At the speed of light, millions of times per second, non-transparently, and in such a way that human beings cannot even see, detect, or monitor the bias as it is happening. That is why regulators are so cracking down on this industry, but with some concerns, with fears that too much regulation could stifle innovation. Next slide, please. Now, what should we do? Anticipate a regulatory patchwork. Regulators do need to strike that balance, but the shout out I really want to give here is for different industries. If you are in the public sector, if you are in financial services, lending, insurance, credit, real estate, any investment, all of that is squarely going to be in the regulatory crosshairs. But the one I want to give a big shout out to, the two actually, are HR. If you are recruiting, hiring, firing, bonusing, compensating, using AI, you are in the regulatory crosshairs. And Sudarshan, you remember that story I was telling you yesterday. I was talking to a CEO in France about this prediction, and he said, well, we don't need to worry about that. We don't use AI in HR. And his head of HR turned to him and said, yes, we do. We use it all over the place. So many companies, sometimes depending on the level, aren't even aware they are using it. So Those sectors matter a lot. The other one, and this matters for India. A lot of Indian companies, of course, have their own AI. That matters. But the other thing is a lot of Indian companies, smaller and medium companies, probably rely on the big hyperscalers to provide AI as a service. Where does the regulatory compliance obligation lie? That's an unknown and complicated question. Next slide, please. One of my Indian colleagues is speaking to this.
Yeah. So sorry. I thought I was on mute. I wasn't for once. Yeah, I'm that delayed next time. I think AI in India so far has been largely contact center oriented. It's more B2B, and therefore it's not come under the ire of the regulators as yet, at least visibly so. We are still putting together the final touches of the data privacy. So I guess this would come into the focus, into the spotlight very shortly. And you highlighted some valid points, Duncan. The interconnectivity of the technology companies in India with their global parents, with their global service providers, could have significant implications on how it evolves. So as of now, I think it would be more a wait and watch to see how it is evolving. But probably we may see some B2C starts, particularly in the edtech space, is something that we foresee where AI actually has a very, can I say, very salutary role to play, provided it's used in the right fashion, in enabling the student to be given the right kind of guidance as he or she progresses on their studies. But yes, as long as it's B2B, it is a little safer. The moment you step into B2C roles, you need to be far more on your guard. And I guess all the Indian companies are very, very, very conscious of what they are doing. Back to you.
Thank you, Sudarshan. And by the way, I am now going to use salutary at least 5 times a day for the rest of the week. So thank you. Awesome word. I haven't heard that in a while. Okay, next slide, please. Women in tech. Oh gosh, I have been writing about this for years, and I have some good news and some bad news. So let's start off with the good news. The good news is that although by and large the pandemic was harmful for women's participation in the workforce around the world, in technology, as a result of a deliberate commitment to hiring more women, we have seen some encouraging signs. Now, before I get ahead of myself, I am going to say if parity is the goal, 50% men, 50% women, we've still got a ways to go. But on the path to parity, we are seeing some growth. Between 2019 and 2022, the 20 largest technology companies in the world saw a 2 percentage point gain in the percentage of women in their overall workforce. You can see that there to just under 33%. In even more encouraging news, the proportion of women in technical roles rose by 2.5 points, 2.6 in fact. That's even more encouraging. Now, they were further behind, so it's off of a lower base. But my favorite stat on this slide is the growth in women in leadership roles. Technology companies have seen a greater than 4 percentage point gain in that's more than a point a year. That's moving the needle in a pretty big way. We are seeing more and more female leaders and outpaced the percentage of technical workers. Now, that's enough good news for now. Next slide, please. We did a survey, Deloitte did a survey called Women at Work, and this is a slice of just the thousands who work in the TMT industry. And I really want to draw your attention to the green bars on the right. Prior to the pandemic, 70% of women in TMT that we surveyed said that they were good or extremely good with their work-life balance. That fell by more than half to 32%. Meanwhile, mental well-being once again fell by more than half from 67 to 31%. Now, you kind of got to think that that level of unhappiness with work-life balance and mental well-being would be reflected in their attitudes. Oh, yes. 38% of women feel their organization's commitment to supporting them only 38% feel sufficient. Only 30% say that they increase their access to flexible work. As a result, more than half feel less optimistic, and a staggering 57% expect to leave their employer for a new role within 2 years. Next slide, please. What can companies do about it? Some of this is, I think, relatively obvious. Broader talent pool, recruit from overlooked worker segments. My focus here, retention, Hiring women is the start of the journey. It is not the end of it. If you can't keep your female employees, you're not going to be able to grow those numbers. The other thing is that gender bias is the top obstacle preventing tech women from moving into leadership positions. Tackling bias and culture is absolutely key. One of my Deloitte colleagues is going to fill us in on the local Indian examples, where I think there's also a mix of good and bad news.
Thank you, Duncan. And I must say, I'm so glad to see this trend making its place in the TMT predictions, because this really ensures that technology will remain human. Women in technology is a very, very important and crucial trend, even for India. And I would say from two perspectives. One, very similar to global trends, right? Women at Work survey, the India cut also showed deep, downslide in productivity and motivation of women during COVID. So we need to preserve and secure that women in the jobs. The second is the opportunity. India as a country, we have the largest young population of digital natives, and less than 10% of that today works in technology. So there's a huge potential to be untapped and unlocked over here. So how do we go about it, and what are potential things that we are seeing? One, we are seeing companies are coming forward, and leaders are actually fostering an environment of flexibility. They're embracing it, they're implementing it in spirit, and above all, they're respecting it. There is a recognition that caregiving responsibilities at home are lopsided towards women, and they are extending that extra hand, giving them that flexibility so that they can come forward and make a career here. What is needs to be seen ahead is domestic companies also embracing and replicating these practices from global enterprises. The second element is, while at the start of the career in technology, we see 50-50% men and women in leadership positions, this percentage is less than 5%. Very important is today in the middle and senior management, most of the women would have started their career 15 to 20 years ago. How do you reskill them? How do you have some targeted programs on technology reskilling for women so that they are embraced to reshape their career? The other 2 points is, give women a network, to network and connect with each other. Celebrate the role models so that the young women out there can see the success and can have the aspiration to, reach the pinnacle too. And lastly, catch the talent young. Have tie-ups with educational institutions, identify young talent, mentor them through formal certification and scholarship programs, and also instill an ambition in them to have technology as a career, so that when they make their life choices and balance the societal responsibilities, career doesn't take a backseat. And this requires an equal focus in tier 2 and tier 3 cities in India. So, as we've started on this journey in India, we see a lot of companies doing this. A dent has been made, but yes, no time for us to get complacent yet. There's still miles to go before we can break the ceiling and make the hole in the sky. Thank you, Duncan. And Piyush, over to you for the next trend.
Thanks, Deepti. Can you move to the next slide, please? All right, the Indian telecom sector saw some major policy changes in 2021, which obviously promises to reset the growth trajectory and improve the health for the industry. With a huge demand for internet services, Deloitte estimates that India will have 1 billion smartphone users by the year 2026, from the current base of roughly around 750 million. And that makes it a CAGR of roughly around 6% for the rural segment and probably 2.5% for the urban areas. The important thing to note is that India will purchase in fact, the Indian consumers will purchase 1.7 billion units of smartphones over the next 5 years, contributing to the industry at a total value of $250 billion. Now, that makes this industry probably one of the largest in the world, and India will be the second largest smartphone market going forward. Why is it happening? Why is it happening now and it's not been happening in the past? I think two, three things. Fundamental point is that India, the rural market, which probably did not have a broadband penetration, thanks to the various government initiatives like the BharatNet program, where we're actually rolling out fiber across the 2.5 lakh villages, that will actually help us bring broadband into the country. The second piece is that a lot of e-health programs, fintech programs, health programs, e-learning, etc., is also increasing the adoption of the mobile telephony in the rural market. So I think that largely we'll see a lot of push coming in from the rural market, but India will definitely be probably the second largest market in the world. Also, I think, Duncan, to your point that you were mentioning about the PLI schemes, etc., India has already rolled out a $10 billion semiconductor incentive to be rolled out over the next few years for us to be able to start to manufacture semiconductors in India, which will definitely probably boost. I'm not sure whether $10 billion is enough, but I think it's a step in the right direction for us. The second thing is India has also rolled out a PLI scheme, a performance linked incentive scheme, for a lot of companies to come and start to manufacture handsets and equipments in India. So they're also going to gain out of it. So overall, I think a billion smartphones. This is clearly a market which nobody can miss, both in terms of manufacture and sales in India. Over to the next slide. Okay, India's obviously been talking a lot around 5G and when we're going to get 5G in India. I think the fact is that if I look at the smartphones, while there's a very minimal smartphone being sold from a 5G perspective at this point of time, Deloitte estimates that by the year 2026, in the year 2026, 800 and by the in the year 2026, 310 million smartphones, which will be 80% of the smartphones sold in that year, will be 5G enabled. And over the next 5 years, India is going to sell 840 million 5G enabled devices. Out of the total 1.7 billion devices that we're speaking about, 840 million devices are going to be 5G enabled. Number one. Number two, what's going to happen is because of 5G coming in, while there's a business as usual change in the handsets, India will additionally sell 135 million devices because of 5G coming in. So a lot of us who are not using 5G enabled devices at this point of time will shift to 5G enabled devices in spite of the fact that the useful life of my asset is not yet over. And that makes it an additional market of close to $20 billion. So that makes this market a mammoth market for us. Also, what's going to happen is that today India also has a significantly large second-hand market. I think as the overall economy grows, the market aspirations of the younger youth increases. We will see 95% of the mobiles when will get replaced will be new smartphones in the urban area, and roughly around 80% of the devices in the rural area by 2026 will be replaced by newer devices, as compared to the number which is roughly around 75% and 60% respectively. So I think clearly a billion handset market by 2000, a billion users by 2026, and we're going to sell 1.7 billion devices, smartphone devices, over the next 5 years. A great opportunity for, I think, for all the manufacturers in India. If we can go to the next slide. Now, what is it that companies need to do? I think one is obviously strengthening the manufacturing hub in India. The government has put the right place. The government is giving you a $10 billion semiconductor incentive. The government has rolled out PLI schemes. So I think companies need to realize the potential and start to manufacture in India. We've already seen a lot of manufacturing in India, because of which the exports have increased, the imports have drastically come down. But I think more and more components need to get manufactured in India and just not the assembly of the handsets, because that is the market that everybody has to cater to. The second thing, I think India being, if you have to sell 1.7 billion units over the next 5 years, you need to scale up your after sales market in India. With the widespread market, the wide geographies in India, the after sales market, the regional after sales market has to increase, because India will continue to sell handsets which are going to be probably in the low range or the mid range. That's going to be the largest market for India. And last but not the least, 80% of the users in India are not users who are very comfortable with English or whose their main language is English. While there are a lot of applications available which are in vernacular content, I think, as we call in the tech term, the GUI, that has to be a lot more vernacular in India. For that, the telecom manufacturers have to really start to build up a lot of content which really takes the GUI into various vernacular languages rather than keeping English and Hindi as the primary language, as you move more and more into the rural market and penetrate the smartphones and 5G enabled devices in the rural market. I think with that, we are pretty much done with the TMT predictions that we had. And I think now we'd like to open it up for questions that anybody will have. And we've got 10 minutes with us. So happy to get all the questions with the panelists on the stage. If you can get all the panelists on the stage, please. Thank you. And Deepti, we'll really appreciate if you can just pick up all the questions. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Piyush. So I would request everybody, if you have questions in the panel on the right side of your screen, you can put up a question there, and we can then take it. Uh, I see a couple of questions were already there. Maybe we'll start with that. The first question, and Sriram, if I can pose that to you, it says, how will the recent OpenSea hack affect the NFT market? So, Sriram, would you like to give your comments on that?
Yeah, sure, Deepthi. Thank you. See, OpenSea management has reacted that it has been a phishing attack and people are investigating the matter. We believe that this attack would drive a better postures on consumer awareness while dealing with these exchange platforms, and also in terms of improving the security posture of these exchange platforms. So that is the current view. Thank you.
All right, and we have another question on NFTs, and or if I can take that question to you, it talks about uh, would NFTs be available from music bands too? Do you have any views on that?
That's a
Yeah.
very interesting question. Sorry, Paul, you go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so there are already quite a few attempts to introduce NFTs into the music industry. And one of the aspects which is being looked at is the use of NFTs attached to tickets for concerts. And the reason for that is because there's always a resale market, and the original bands may not benefit from the trade in resold tickets. And with an NFT, you can designate that a commission, say 10% of all trades, goes back to the original band. So it's a way for the aftermarket to happen and to flourish, which it always does. But for the originator or the promoter or the band to get a share of some of that upside.
All right. Duncan, if I could come to you next, there's a question around chips which says, what should electronic hardware, semi-chip makers, chip design companies, chip-based startups, software players do now? What are the starting steps for them?
So, as I did mention, we have a 25-page report talking about this in a level of detail. Some of it is obviously building new capacity. Some of it is building new capacity closer. Much of it has to do with increasing digital transformation will help even in the short term. Most of it comes down to moving from so there's a whole thing out there called lean manufacturing, and that's about driving down inventories and optimizing for price. And we posed the question in that report I wrote, is there such a thing as too lean? And the answer clearly is yes. What we are seeing a number of buyers of chips, buyers and distributors, is moving to more aggressive strategies. There is a thing out there called an NCNR. That's a non-cancelable, non-recallable order. This is where you put down money now for chips that you might not even get for 2 years. Point one. Point two, it's where you put down more money now. In other words, you're paying a premium for it rather than always fighting for the lowest price. You are also attempting to carry higher levels of inventory in your work in progress and so forth. Now, I will caution, there's a bit of a story here. Back in, April, May of 2021, many auto manufacturers were in terrible trouble. Many smartphone manufacturers were in terrible trouble. And one auto manufacturer and one smartphone manufacturer was kind of doing okay, no shortages, because they had higher levels of inventory and they weren't quite as lean. After about 2 months of that, everybody runs out of inventory eventually. So the whole lean, not too lean thing, there's a limit that can buffer, that can help a bit, but in and of itself, a deep enough, long enough, severe enough chip shortage hits everybody.
All right, thanks, Duncan. I think we have time for couple of more questions. So one is on wearable, smart wearables. So Paul, if I can come to you, they say, it's a question they've asked from perspective of government, that do we see governments adopting smartwatches to deliver some of the public health services? What's the role that smartwatches can play in public health services?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there have been attempts to get governments involved in smartwatches, and in one country, there was an offer which is part of a trial for 2 years. So it's Singapore, whereby in exchange for doing exercise, you would get a smartwatch or a discount on a smartwatch. And it's similar to what a lot of insurance companies have offered, and also some fitness companies have offered too. So I think we're still at the early stage. I think so far the results are not perhaps as enthusiastic as had been expected, but I do think there is a very powerful role in there. I think to some extent what it requires is a change of philosophy, because healthcare systems are built to treat people who have become unwell, rather than to try and prevent them becoming unwell in the first place. And prevention rather is always going to be more cost efficient, but that calculation isn't always done.
One thing I would add is that the smart patches are always reimbursable by insurance companies, and always in countries like Canada, or I guess the UK with the NHS, smart patches are always provided by the government. So the watch market is a little different, but smart patches are always, at this point, fully paid for by governments or insurers.
One last
and
question.
Dipti, just me, if I may
Yeah.
add an India flavor, I know that.
Sure.
Just a quick one, and smart patches is what I was coming to. I thought we would probably enter into an era of what I call assisted healthcare. So we would not necessarily have the medical fraternity involved, but probably somebody who are trained, something like the paramedical that we use otherwise, trained to provide certain amount of preventive and probably a first level of diagnostic or treatment healthcare through these patches, because that's the way we can cover the larger market. There's a very large underserved population in this country, and technology is perhaps the means rather than create more and more doctors. Technology is the means to minimize the load on the healthcare system. So that's probably what we will see, but this is purely a conjecture. I don't have any insight in what the government is thinking.
Okay, I'll take one last question, and quite interesting, and maybe Sudarshan, if you could take that. Do you think pandemic has impacted the TMT industry in a positive way, and has it been a catalyst in accelerating phenomenal growth? So,
I think I'll ask Duncan to lead it first. He's seen it from there. I'll talk from a supply perspective because we are providers of technology, but the consumption is global. Yeah.
It's a hard question to answer, because you don't want to look like, because so many people were sick and affected and so forth. So there's been terrible cost to the pandemic. However, the question is unquestionably that the entire tech sector, the telecom sector, has been positively affected by. We have seen literally years or decades of progress in a relatively short period of time. Now it's more mixed, obviously, for media. Things like cinema and so forth, live events, obviously very strong negative impact. But certainly, I'd argue for tech and telecom, by and large, a positive impact. Sudarshan?
Yes, Duncan. I know it is a misfortune too, but there are certain things that we redeem ourselves with, and one is the accelerated digitization. I think that's very, very important, because this digitization was happening. It was not as if pandemic kick-started something new. This was happening, but in a very muted manner, in a very staggered fashion. But right now, this accelerated the process of digitization. I think there are some good things that will emanate out of it. It will help us reach a lot more people. It make technology more democratic. I think the democratization of technology is what the pandemic has provided for. That's an opportunity to glean something good out of this misfortune that we all have attained here.
Yeah, one nuance on Duncan's comment. I think definitely there's been a lot more demand for tech and telecoms, and there's been more paid for tech. But for telecoms, there hasn't been very much more paid for it.
True. We're using it. We're not paying more.
Yeah.
Piyush, any comments from your side?
No, I think as Duncan Sudarshan said, clearly telecom. I think in the initial phase of the pandemic, the telecom in India probably saw a little bit of dip, because India being a largely a prepaid market, there weren't any places where you could actually recharge. So the overall revenues went down. But I think subsequently it's helped, not in terms of the revenue, but I think, as you rightly said, I think we are using it a lot more, and I think it's really helped probably spread digitization probably 5 years ahead of what we could have done probably in the past. So not a very positive way to look at it because of the pandemic, but I think from a telco perspective, I think digitization has truly happened. So there is definitely something to look forward to.
Right, right. So I see a lot more questions coming in. Unfortunately, we've hit at the top of the hour. So we will respond to all the questions we couldn't take right now. We will respond through an email. So all of you would get responses for that. Jahir, if I can hand it over to you for closeout.
Thank you, Dipti. And firstly, I want to, thank all our panelists and especially Duncan and Stuart. Sorry, Duncan and Paul. Um, you know, and through various dry runs and ups and downs for joining us today. I think a very, very insightful session. I think we got a perspective on a number of areas, but I was especially, I think intrigued and glad that we covered uh, topics that like women in tech, um, and AI ethics. I mean, typically when we talk about a TMT report, we tend to talk about market size and technology development and things like that. But uh, but areas like this tend to get ignored, but they do have such a major impact on the ecosystem, how the whole TMT sector progresses around the world. And like you said, I mean, this really, as we hopefully come out of the pandemic, this has been a really eventful 2 years for the sector. I think we'll have some interesting times ahead. Um, as EVs develop, as wearables develop, as 5G comes in, and we'll have a lot more interesting things to discuss next year and the year after that. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.